Hello, everybody. My name is Marcus Brazil. I'm from Sooner Safer Happier, and I'm very excited to be hosting this event with my co-host today, Jen Ryan, who's also from Sooner Safer Happier in Asia Pacific. We're very excited to be hosting Dr. Mik Kersten just 1 week out from his new book launch. His new book is Output to Outcome, an Operating Model in the Age of AI, and you can pre-order your copies on Amazon now. As Jen mentioned, this is an Ask Me Anything or AMA event. So now to introduce our guest, I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Mik Kersten. Mik is the author of Project to Product, which I think created a fundamental shift in how we think about value delivery across many organizations. Mik is also the founder of TaskTop, which he went on to lead for 17 years before Planview was acquired before Planview acquired TaskTop in 2022. Mik went on to become the CTO of Planview and is now an executive in residence with Planview. So, in preparation for this call, I've been lucky enough to read Mik's book. It's absolutely fantastic. I highly recommend it, and I think it will be just as influential as Project Product. And I think it will be one of the books of our defining books of our time in the age of AI. So, on to my questions. So, firstly, Mik, congratulations on your new book. It seemingly it times so well, just as AI agents are now becoming, mainstream. I'm fascinated to understand what were you seeing in the data in the field that led you to believe this shift was coming, and how did you time the book so well?
Thanks, Marcus. I think the book timing, I'll answer those separately, I guess, because the book timing is always interesting, right? Books are very much a waterfall project, and where it was over 18 months ago that I started writing. But let me just touch on what led me to it, because it really was all that data that we had collected on how organizations were going on that shift to a product operating model. And a lot of that was collected from the Project to Product State of the Industry report, where we collected systems data on how value was flowing through organizations' tool chains and value streams. And that's where we were able to synthesize some of the kind of key findings that led me to realize that most organizations were just not ready for the kind of acceleration that was coming from AI. Now, of course, you look back 2, 3 years ago, I think we've all been, the people here, the people attending, I'm sure a lot of the people listening, we've all been trying to help our organizations turn more and more of, the end-to-end flow of value into actual value creation, value delivery, right? That finding from the Project to Product State in this industry report that was run by TaskTop and by Planview, we can put a link. I actually just recently posted a full summary on Substack. I realized there was not, all that information was public, but there wasn't sort of one end-to-end summary of what we learned in that report. So I did get a chance to write it up, I think, just last week. And if you go to Mik Kersten on Substack, you'll see it there. But one of the most stark findings, and really how output to outcome starts, is this chart I showed in meeting after meeting, where we basically analyzed the end-to-end flow of value, and only 8% of that time was spent on value creation done by teams. This, by the way, interestingly, since we're here, it was that some of the initial anchoring was from John Smart's slide at DevOps Enterprise Summit a million years ago, where he was showing all these handoffs, things upstream of teams and downstream of teams, really causing all these wait states, right? So I think we're all familiar with it. And a lot of us were on this journey of helping organizations move beyond that, right? Move into making more of that. In the way I show the chart, always, the teams are the green stuff and the bottlenecks and constraints upstreams and downstreams of red, but turning more value stream green and less red. And then sort of while we were working on all of this, I spent 2.5 years working on building out an agentic framework for really doing project and product management and the transition from project to product and all of this as in my role as CTO of Planview. And I got to see firsthand not only how these things work under the hood, but really how they change the way that teams work and how this acceleration can come. It was back then, so if we look back 2 years ago, it was obviously the early days of agents, but I think it was already fairly obvious that 2x multiples in team productivity were feasible, right? That's not everyone had them, but they were possible. And that 10x would be possible eventually as well, as long as frontier models kept building out these capabilities. And at that point, I realized, okay, I think, I wanted to focus in on the things where organizations got stuck in deploying a product operating model and capture those lessons. Uh, but then also, of course, look at how this could really the core mechanisms of that shift to a product operating model could really enable organizations to leverage that amplification coming from AI. And so that was really the inspiration. The timing of the book was it's just impossible at time. I was trying to think about, like, hey, by the time this book is done, will we have had the bubble, like the AI bubble burst? Will we have AGI? Like, it just seemed like so far out. I just decided to base most of the assumptions in the book on first principles. And there are some interesting ones that are, there are assumptions. Like the book makes an assumption that AI doesn't develop consciousness tomorrow, and all humans and organizations report to AI. It actually makes the opposite assumption. It says AI provides this amazing amplification, but we actually need humans to report to humans and leverage agents to amplify outcomes. So there was definitely uh, some forecasting I needed to do of what I thought was likely, was not likely in terms of when the book would publish. I remember I had some interesting conversations that I thought it was a 50-50 chance it'd be before or after an AI bubble burst. But either way, I think that from looking at from first principles, it's the same issue, that organizations would be investing very heavily into AI, but if they were not doing it in the right ways or doing it without the right operating model, they would not be getting much return.
Oh, fantastic. And that's a good segue for my next question, Mick. And I love that the fact that the book is grounded in data. And that's such an impactful stat that only 8% has been spent on value creation in the data that you're seeing through project to products to state of the industry report. But next question is, given these shifts you're seeing, and the need to shift from output to outcomes, could you give us like a high level map or overview of some of the key concepts that go into the operating model for the age of AI? I think this will help to tee up some questions for the audience. So what are some of the key pillars or foundational elements in the operating model, to succeed in the age of AI?
Right. And so I think this boils down, there are kind of three core pillars, or three core models. The book really is this set of mental models, not large language models, but mental models that I think we can all apply to leverage AI to drive not just output, but outcomes. And that first one is that product operating model, right? So I think this is something that's fairly well understood, and it's Matt Ring just posted, "We are so freaking agile." Yeah, that's the name of that chart, right? That chart, that's sort of the anti-product model where everything's a handoff, and where there's just so much burden for teams in that kind of system. So really, the first part of the book looks in more depth than Project to Product did on the definition of a product operating model and the key mechanisms around the product operating model that are needed. For example, the thing that I probably should have put in Project to Product, but somehow didn't, is like, what's a project? What's a product? Right? Organizations still have projects, right? If I don't know, you're in some financial industry and all of a sudden regulations change, or healthcare regulations change, and then you're in healthcare drug discovery, there's a project associated with that. What's a product and what's a platform? So those kinds of things. But fundamentally, a product operating model is around creating these stable teams and value streams that can deliver to a customer. And then output to outcome definitely takes it a step further, because it looks at the ownership structures around those value streams. So the point being that in the end, the leadership and team of a value stream, and the value stream, you can really think about product, sub-product, platform, and so on, however your organization defines value streams. The key thing is that they have end-to-end ownership of the outcomes, and they're empowered to own outcomes, but the outputs are really in the control of the teams in terms of how they build out those outputs. And really, that's kind of some of the core mechanisms. I had this, since Matt Ring's on this call, I had this interesting conversation about this with Matt, or correspondence about it. I think we need really a few different elements for these product transformations to work, right? One element is they need to be cultural elements, right? And there needs to be, support for training and mentoring and all these sorts of things. And what I was seeing is that the industry got better and better at that, but that there were these organizational mechanisms that were getting in the way of those things being successful. So I'll give you for example, if you've got the best kind of cultural transformation around the shift to a product model, to AI engineering and so on, but the incentive structure of leaders is completely misaligned to that, well, guess what? Wins out, right? All that goodwill that comes from the culture will kind of hit the wall of how people are bonus and compensated, and somehow those silos will remain. So rewinding back just a little bit, my goal with output to outcome was to help create mechanisms that would, or define mechanisms that people could take to create the right kind of empowerment, ownership, and the cultural structure. So it's not a book on culture, but it's a book on the mechanisms that I think allow healthy cultures to thrive and shift away from some of the cultural dysfunctions that a lot of organizations see. So really the core of that, again, is this ownership and accountability of product value streams. But then the next model is called the outcome loop. So it goes product operating model, outcome loop. By the way, the third one is the outcome tree. Those are the three fundamental models. The outcome loop further defines that ownership structure in the context of a business, right? Because project to product didn't talk that much around how budgets were fed into a value stream. But if a value stream doesn't have ownership of its budgets and driving its own outcomes, you don't really have true ownership. And then the next part of that is, well, how do you scale that? Because if you've got a large organization, it's not just one value stream. It's a cascade and hierarchy of value streams, chances are, right? Or you might have a complex network of them and many dependencies between them. And to really scale that, I think what we need to do is scale an ownership structure that supports it. So what output to outcome suggests in terms of mechanisms is this outcome tree, where you're actually taking where your organizational chart and your value stream, basically your product portfolio, the hierarchy of your value streams become one structure. And that leadership structure matches the incentive structure, which matches the empowerment and ownership structure, so that teams can really have end-to-end ownership what they're delivering, whether they're using, you've got 2 people on a team and hundreds of agents, or many people on a team and a smaller number of agents, that there is that end-to-end ownership of teams, and that we move away from this, let's say the dysfunction around that would be that all of a sudden with AI, there's kind of no more team ownership, and it's the executive team owning everything down, right? So I think the very important thing for me in terms of these structures is, again, to provide that encapsulation ownership, and in a way that scales with the size of the organization, which truly is this, from the point of view of output outcome, this alignment between the organizational structure, and I mean a one-to-one alignment between the organizational structure and the outcome tree and value stream structure.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you for providing that overview. And I'm sure there must be lots of questions from our community. So just to phrase back the kind of 3 key elements you mentioned, one was the product operating model or product value streams. There's also the outcome loop and the outcome tree, which you're saying are 3 mental models for how to make the shift from output to outcome in the operating model in the age of AI.
That's right.
So looking forward to lots of questions about these. So keep them coming, folks. We've already got some coming through. My next question is AI return on investment. We're seeing a lot more conversation now around token costs increasing or becoming more visible. I think Uber blew through its agentic AI budget in the first quarter of this year. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on why organizations are struggling to achieve return on investment from AI thus far.
Yeah, so I think we've got a couple things here, but they kind of, they all point back to the title of the book, which is that if you're really managing to maximize outputs, and those are not directly connected in a feedback loop to outcomes, you don't actually know what you're optimizing. Because in the end, what's happened in this is this really fundamental shift of with AI, which is that outputs are becoming much more scalable, much cheaper, and eventually, for certain kinds of knowledge work, they'll basically trend to the cost of electricity. This is not to say that tokens are cheap, right? Because if you're using I guess as of tomorrow, July 7th, Mythos and Fable tokens will probably feel very expensive to many people when when those costs go up. So I think we've got this amazing power to amplify with AI. But if we're amplifying something that's constrained elsewhere, we're not getting the value. So going back to that 8%, right? If we imagine the end-to-end flow of value through an organization, a value stream, a team, and so on, or a set of teams, if the constraint is not at the 8%, but we make the team 5 times more productive, we're actually not getting any more throughput through the system because that was not the constraint. And that's really the fundamental thesis of output to outcome, which is that we need to apply the theory of constraints to value streams to get that amplification, acceleration, parallelized hypothesis testing, all those benefits that we can get from AI. And if we don't do that, if we actually don't apply the theory of constraints and don't look at applying AI to the bottleneck, not just to more output of code, of systems, of applications, then it's very unclear what return we're actually getting. And what's happening right now is that obviously, I think for very good reasons, it's important that organizations are learning and experimenting and actually spending money on those tokens. Unless you start, you're not really going to understand where things are working, where they're not. But the operating model of the majority of those organizations, even some of the newer, the Ubers, some of the unicorns, and even some of these digital native organizations, the operating models has not been optimized for measuring, has not been optimized for measuring outcomes because outputs have been the constraint, right? If you've got a car factory, you've kind of got a stable marketing and sales pipeline, you're kind of leading a car manufacturer, you really are output constrained because the more cars you produce, the more you'll sell. All of a sudden now, for knowledge work, like building software, the constraints on outputs are gone, right? So you can spend all you want on outputs, but unless you're delivering customer value, you're delivering the outcome loop actually focus on delivering both customer value and employee value, because I think both are very intertwined. But if you're not doing measuring those things and optimizing on those things, then you're spending money without a clear ROI. And I think the writing was on the wall, a year ago, 18 months ago, when I was writing the book, where organizations were leading into this. We saw some organizations actually become more disciplined around it to see what return they were getting, even though back then tokens and AI spend seemed pretty cheap, and of course got much more expensive with agents who can easily consume 100 or 1,000 times the tokens for some similar tasks. But we're now at the point where unless you change your operating model to apply AI to the constraint, again, you're not going to get that value. And then, of course, there's now going to be some backlash because of how expensive these things are getting without demonstrating value, as we've seen at organizations like Uber, to your point, Marcus.
Such a cogent description, the fact that we're moving from scarcity to abundance in some of these traditional outputs that have been produced, meaning outcomes are now more important than ever to be measured. I think that's a very, very powerful point in your book. So my final question before we throw it open to the community, and it's great to see the questions coming through, so again, please keep them coming, is in reading the book, I recognize some work you've put in there by Dr. Carlota Perez, and we're huge fans of her work at Sooner Safer Happier. So the book is anchored in history. And so how would you say that the previous technology shifts that we've seen in the past, how do they inform the age of AI shift that we're now seeing ourselves in?
Yeah, I think that the work of Dr. Calipez is obviously very relevant, and in the sense that, and the way I apply it in output to outcomes, to look at how in through each of these ages, what kinds of systems, and especially management systems, were created to help organizations thrive. Because I think that, obviously, I think the goal of everyone here, the goal of output to outcomes, is to have as many of our organizations, of your organizations, thrive and really leverage these benefits, right? I think we're better off if we have many organizations leveraging AI for good than we have a very small number of organizations just collecting rents on tokens. So and of course, we also need those organizations to continue innovating. So, in Carla Perez's view, there's, through technological revolutions, you go through through this basically wave. There's this massive installation period. Organizations learn how to use the technology. There's a tends to be a whole lot of concentration of the benefits at that point. And then there's the diffusion where you get more broad-based use of the technology. And then in her model is actually this golden age where it in the end benefits society. So right now, yeah, across the world, I think to many people, it's feeling like it's not evenly benefiting society. And I think that's a major issue. I think, and I've spent enough time talking to Carlota Perez to be inspired by her to help these technological revolutions provide more benefit. And again, I think the only way to do that is if the benefits of that technology are broadly based across, as broadly based across the economy as possible, which again goes back to more organizations learning how to operate with the new dynamics. So that's the very high level thing. Now, at the next level down in terms of her models and approach to this, is the fact that in each of these revolutions, some key constraint on production was relaxed, was removed, right? So obviously, when we got, starting in the Industrial Revolution, water was able to replace human power for all sorts of activities. And as soon as that happens, some organizations, and then there was there was the power was water, then steam, then electricity, then combustion, then compute in the age of software and digital. And now what's fascinating about the age of AI, it's now actually cognition, intelligence has been automated. So really, I think what we saw in each of these ages, because I think it's useful to look back at them to see which of the lessons from past ages we can apply to help organizations through this one. Each of these revolutions, there was some key constraint was removed. And in basically the past revolution, there were some managerial mechanisms and models that were defined that had to evolve in order to be able to leverage that new kind of power, that new automation, those new kinds of innovation. So, I don't know how much of a history lesson we want here, but I'll make it really quick. But we had first we got the division of labor, then we got centralized oversight, the org charts, right? And each of these, by the way, is still around, which is interesting, right? Like we still use org charts. Those are from the age of steam and railways, where you had people who had to be managed across a very distributed network of literal railways in the U.S. Then scientific management helping us scale these systems, and then basically lean and project management came. And then in the age of software and digital, we got agile and we got product management. And of course, each of these things was really fine-tuned to helping optimize the constraints of that particular age, right? Agile, even though a lot of organizations, to relate to the start of the stocks, thought they were very freaking agile, but actually weren't. Those organizations that did achieve agility at scale were able to deliver more value to their customers. But really, that was all that entire focus of agile was really around prioritizing scarce constraints in development and really unblocking all those things that were causing friction upstream and downstream of teams, that were slowing things down. And now, again, that's not enough, right? Now it's no longer about necessarily prioritizing which features we're going to build for the next set of features for the mobile banking application or healthcare application. It's now what we're actually seeing is AI native organizations are building 10 of the applications and seeing which one works best, right? All of a sudden, the dynamics change completely from what was the constraint, which is kind of capacity on the development teams, to now nearly unlimited, or at least token based. And of course, we still have people either in the loop or supporting these agentic workflows. Where those agile principles, again, they made sense. I think they'll stick around forever, as will org charts, but they're no longer sufficient to managing basically nearly unlimited or at least highly scaled outputs. And that's where I think, in the last stage, the key constraint, and this is where I built on some of Carlota's analysis and output to outcome, where I identified each of the key constraints for that particular age. In the last one, when the key constraint was knowledge worker and developer productivity, right? That's no longer a constraint. I actually think the constraint now becomes organizational productivity. So we're now seeing the organization as the key constraint to delivering customer outcomes. We're seeing the patterns of what AI native organizations look like. I use the example of Cognition, as well as the Microsoft Visual Studio Code team as kind of two different examples of what AI native organizational structures and technical structures look like. And really, I think this new discipline that we need to shift to of outcome management, where teams are empowered to deliver end-to-end outcomes.
Wow, fantastic. Thanks, Mick. So we're heading over to our community questions now, and I believe the first one is from Ryan Jewell. What I'm going to do, folks, is ask you to take yourself off mute, and I'd like you to ask the question yourself. So, Ryan, do we have Ryan? Would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Go back to my question to make sure I got the wording right. Yes. So Mick, with the flow framework that you described in Project to Product, how do you see that persisting in the age of AI, or do you think that that too must necessarily now change?
Right. So that was definitely a big question for me. So I thought I'd be building the Flow Framework 2.0. And that's actually how I started on this journey of writing output to outcome. I registered output to outcome domain ages ago because I thought, okay, this is like eventually this will happen where we'll be constrained on outcomes. But and then obviously that became the book title. But the journey started with me looking at, okay, what do we need for Flow Framework 2.0? And after looking at a lot of the data and digging in, I realized that it was really not so much around issues that we saw with the ability for organizations to measure flow. It was about expanding that, right? Because in the end, flow is, of course, the goal is it's end to end. But when you're measuring flow, you're measuring what's been kind of taken from a plan, something that's on the plan, and made it to a customer. And so the flow framework is actually just directly embedded in the models and output to outcome. The only thing I really did is just to simplify it, because the flow framework and project to product, I think there are important concepts in there, like there's the alignment index and the product index and so on. Those weren't used as much by organizations, I noticed. And so I simplified it. I just took things out of the flow framework to simplify it. And that's that flow framework 1.1 basically is what's in output to outcome. So it's a simplified version, and then it's embedded into the outcome loop. So it's one of the ways, so it's one of the key telemetry mechanisms for measuring whether you've got, basically, you're able to deliver various artifacts, and it's still the flow items, features, defects, risks, and debts, and finding constraints on delivering those artifacts. Because if that's the constraint, well, you should apply agile practices, lean practices, AI to removing that constraint, right? But of course, there are other key mechanisms in the outcome loop that go beyond flow. And so this notion of tracking objectives and key results and feedback loops and so on, those are all primary. So it really, what happened is the flow framework stayed. It didn't transform as much as I thought it would. So again, there is no 2.0. It's just a 1.1 version. And then it's encapsulated by a lot more in terms of the outcome loop. And then this outcome tree, which is the outcome tree is just a nesting of outcome loops.
Fantastic.
Thanks.
Great question, Ryan. So we're going to go to a question now from Phil. Phil, would you like to come off mute?
Good to see you, Phil. And Phil just wrote a book.
I'm just trying to. Can you hear me all right?
Oh, it's a different Phil. Sorry, Phil Clark
No,
wrote a book. Phil G. Phil G, did you write a book?
No.
I'm sorry if I.
Phil, he has written a book.
Oh, there we go. Good.
There it is. How are you doing, mate? Good morning. I do have my pajamas on, which is why I'm not turning the camera on. So we'll have to just go with that for now. Look, my question is, and we've sort of talked about this a little bit. We're kind of seeing the same issues with, I guess, what we saw with trying to adopt agile at organizational level, trying to move from project to product, of which even that's probably not. You look at organizations that said they have, and you look at the data, they're kind of still going through that journey. We're kind of seeing the same impediments emerge. So I guess my question, which is probably a little bit of a segue, is how are you in your customer conversations dealing with those things as they surface? Because I think they seem to be very similar. as the constraints to adopting agentic capability. So how do you sort of deal with those things as they surface with your customers when you talk to them?
Yeah, and I think that's a good observation, right? Which is that organizations keep hit that, and that was consistent with what we saw in the data, is that organizations keep hitting up against the same constraints. So, and I think what I realized is that for a lot of organizations that go through this product operating model transformation, and really the agile teams and the technology teams were mostly there. But then again, so the way the business operated, the way the business planned, the way that the business does funding was not quite there, right? So, oftentimes you'd sit, and this is, there's a spectrum, of course, but you'd have project funding of product value streams. You'd still have basically, constant approvals. You would not have proper ownership of outcomes or even separation of outcomes. For a lot of organizations, they cannot properly attribute which business outcomes they were driving because there's not a clear segmentation in terms of the actual portfolio structure of the business. And actually working at Planview gave me an interesting perspective on that, because Planview does strategic portfolio management tools. So we got to see all this data, and there's just this I realize there's this really big disconnect between really the kind of business level portfolio structure, the technology portfolio structure, and then the org chart. And then, of course, the incentive structure of leadership, which I mentioned, just when we were related to a previous question that had come up, is this other structure that's overlaid on top of that. And I realized that it's the matrixing and the mix-up of these structures that's actually causing so many of these problems, and both in terms of teams not being sufficiently empowered, so not having independence of action in terms of what they can, what they're delivering, in terms of dependencies arising between value streams and platforms and products everywhere, in terms of again, mismatches between sort of incentive structures and OKR structures and all those sorts of things. So I realized, and looking at all of these, the challenge is these structures that the organization has formed, both do not align effectively to a product operating model, which if you look at a technology native company, a company built in the last 5-10 years, they actually do tend to line up. They do tend to be, there does tend to be this single structure. And those are the things getting in the way. And they are the same things that were getting in the way of product transformations that are now getting in the way of getting that ROI benefit from AI. So that's really what Output to Outcome tackles, is how to create a single structure where that whole product and value stream structure, the organizational chart, and really the technology, and now, of course, AI-driven technology are create and incentive structure and objective cascade all create are just a single organizational structure.
Yeah, thanks, Mik. It's actually an interesting inflection point at the moment. I think there's more probably power with agentic adoption than Agile had to actually shift operating models and structures. So we'll see how that emerges.
Yeah, I think that's a good observation, because I think it certainly highlights puts a much bigger spotlight on the problem, right? If you're delivering all of this and not getting the value. So I think the last time we had this big a shift, if you look at it from the kind of the CEO and the CFO's perspective, was cloud, right? Cloud was the first really big new spend item that the CFO had to pay attention to. It was that big, right? The hosting costs. Like before they had, there's infrastructure costs, but that shift to cloud really, I think it did help make the case for a lot of organizations for becoming more agile, for basically creating these developer productivity and DevOps initiatives, right? So in that sense, it helped a lot because it removed that that deployment constraint, but it was at a significant cost. And so I think there was significant organizational investment, whether it was the SRE model, DevOps, and the combinations of agile there, DevSecOps, everything else. And yeah, I think now it's going to be even bigger because the AI costs are even larger. And so there's going to be an even sort of bigger spotlight there. And I think even bigger course correction that organizations who haven't actually looked at creating these sort of team empowering structures are going to have to look at. So I think that's really, for a lot of organizations, the next 6 months, especially if they've blown through their 2026 AI budgets already, is a big opportunity to start making some of those organizational changes. So
Yeah,
now,
definitely. I won't take any more of your time, though. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Great,
oh, no
great,
problem.
great
And then
question.
just to wrap up that thought is like, but then it goes back to that challenge that we saw with the shift from project to product, which is the organizational changes are harder. You can't just say, okay, technology teams, go fix yourselves. It's actually a bigger problem, but I think also now an opportunity to actually fix some of the core organizational issues. Because if you don't, again, you won't get that ROI from the AI investment, and then of course
No,
your competition will. So
definitely. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got lots of questions to get through. And next two questions both come from somebody called Chris. And I'm going to throw to Chris Coombe first. So please take it away, Chris.
Hi, Mick. Hope you're well. I think Phil kind of stole my thunder and asked a very similar question. So I think really just to sort of TLDR the question and distill it, are you actually seeing organizations that you talk to willing to take the hard yards and actually make those changes that you just talked about? Because I think it's a little bit like, learning any kind of new skill, you need to actually learn the foundations. And I worry from my own observations that people see this new technology like magic, and it almost doesn't mean I need to think critically anymore, and somehow the AI can do the hard thinking for me and all the work. And so how do you sort of see that in the wild with people thinking about, I need to change my structure, I need to change the, all the other elements that you talked about in terms of incentives, etc. And are people willing to actually do that?
right. So it's a very good question. I think, I think people do, a lot of organizations do sort of think they'll be able to wave this magic wand with AI, just increase the spend and get the right results. And I think that's wrong. And that's why I wrote a book. So because I think, and interestingly, and this goes back to Marcus's earliest question on the timing, is I was just wondering when that would happen, right? As organizations need to make these harder decisions and are sort of the benefits, again, the benefits won't be there, but I think there is this, and it's, whether it's lack of critical thinking or systems thinking or lack of visibility or telemetry or these sorts of things. I think there is this, we're seeing this view as like, okay, I've got the magic of AI. I'll now be able to cut X% of my employee base and either and accelerate things. And now I think we're now getting into that phase where a lot of organizations have actually, their stories are now spreading. Organizations who made the cuts were now having to rehire, right? And studies coming around out around that, including a recent one from, or today's, I think, from Gartner. So I think, I guess it's kind of back to Phil's point that there's now going to be a pretty big spotlight that's shining on some of those organizational issues and why didn't this work, and where I think old ways of working will need to be quickly replaced, because I think the pace of the AI adoption is so fast as well, which I think changes things, right? Like cloud just felt slower in terms of how quickly it was picked up by enterprise compared to what we're seeing right now with AI adoption.
Okay. Oh, good, Chris. Good question. So we'll go to the next Chris,
Thanks.
Chris North. Please take it away, Chris.
Yeah, so the question is, in a world of AI where you're increasing outputs at an accelerated rate, what measures of success or what metrics matter?
Right. And so I think and this is where we get back to the structure of the outcome loop. And I realize not everyone has that in their hands. Mark has got an early PDF here. But the outcome loop is basically, you've got inputs, those are strategy and your budget. Outputs, it's really simple, actually. Those are all the activities that our teams and agents do and the artifacts they produce, and then outcomes. And outcomes just go into customer outcomes, employee outcomes, together making business outcomes. So the outcome metrics are really what your kind of customer, business, and employee metrics are, right? So those need to be partitioned in this clean way across the entire portfolio. So customer outcome metrics have to do with some kind of customer success, whether that's customer net promoter scores or retention. Business metrics have to do with profitability, revenues, growth, market share, and so on. Employee metrics, employee satisfaction, employee net promoter scores. And what's changed with AI is like, and really the point of the flow framework was to provide leading indicators to those metrics, right? Because it takes from when we add a new feature, new capabilities to a product, there's often a lag before we actually see customer satisfaction or revenue or cost profiles or those sorts of things change. But what's happening with AI, and really why there's a different approach to this, or beyond, that goes beyond the flow framework and output to outcome, is that feedback loop can move very quickly. So you can now much more quickly deliver really large sets of capabilities. Like before, it could have been 6 months from when you started building a mobile application to when you had customers at scale. And for some organizations, it would have been 24 months. But you know, it was somewhere in months. Whereas now those things can happen in days. So it's actually now kind of the lag that we had before with outcome metrics has been, I think, shortened massively. And so it really is all around connecting kind of what you've planned in terms of the initiatives, the roadmaps, what you're delivering, to outcomes, and creating this very fast feedback loop where we're already seeing organizations who paralyze that feedback loop, right? Where you'll deliver multiple things and you'll see which one works best to understand. Whereas before, everything was sequential. And now, again, that loop moves much faster. And those business, employee, and customer metrics we can actually see their impact much more quickly. So those metrics are usually already in your business. The flow metrics, as we talked about, are still relevant because they're kind of how efficiently you can actually get things into customers' hands, like the full round trip. And within that, there's obviously all of the planning components that have to do with planning, funding, and a new structure that I'll put up an ad called the outcome roadmap is there as well, to make sure that everything being built on is connected to some kind of outcome. But these really are the kinds of outcomes that we already have somewhere in the organization. They just don't have, oftentimes, sort of their ownership structures are very diluted, right? There's too many OKRs, too many KPIs, and those sorts of things. So output to outcome actually has very specific guidance of moving away from this mess of business metrics, KPIs, OKRs, plans and roadmaps, and into a consistent set of metrics for the outcome loop, and then scaling those outcome loops in a cascade.
Good. I'm seeing a nod from Chris. Thank you. Great question. So next question comes from Melinda. I think you're dialing in from your iPhone, Melinda. You able to come off mute and ask your question, please?
Oh, I'm sorry, in infrastructure. So what if you're not in a value stream, or do you envision that everybody gets in a value stream? Because there's areas of infrastructure that it may not make sense to put into a value stream.
Yeah, okay. And this is kind of one of the other, I think, areas where project to product fell a bit short in terms of its guidance. So output to outcome, actually, there's a full chapter on looking at the whole organization as a set of these nested value streams. So and really where you've got kind of customer facing products, internal facing products, platforms, shared services, infrastructure, and all of those really fit into this outcome tree at some place in the tree. So the idea is to actually treat infrastructure as a product, and to apply the same kind of principles to it, but of course with a very different set of metrics, right? We're not gonna be looking at direct profitability for infrastructure. Instead, a metric, an outcome metric for infrastructure, is what it's supporting, is how many revenue generating or market facing products it's supporting. So there's really and there's different flow metrics that we want to look at. So there's different outcome metrics, different flow metrics. And so the idea is to look at all of the work being done by the organization, partition it into these different domains. Incubation projects are also very different. They're not going to make any, where you might experiment the most with AI. So they're not going to make any near-term revenue either. So that's not a proper outcome metric for an incubation project. Really, incubation projects are about learning. Infrastructure is about scaling and stability, and compliance and those sorts of things. So, the core idea is that all of these principles apply, but all of the metrics, the telemetry, the planning has to be tailored to the kind of value stream that you're operating.
Terrific. Thank you. Our next question is from Zachariah. Please take it away, Zachariah.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, my question is linked to what Chris was talking about. So essentially, considering that now a lot of the work on increasing flow and effectively addressing bottlenecks is looking as going to have a result of having more and more outputs rather than outcome. And I just want to ask, Mik, in your conversations with the organization that you spoke to as part of writing your book, have you come across the people who are doing something really well, which is looking at outcome bottlenecks rather than output bottlenecks? And what is it that they do really well?
Yeah. And so again, I think this is one of the key cruxes, and it's in output outcome, it's really around outcome loop optimization. So I think we've gotten pretty good at optimizing outputs, or at least we've got a decade or two of materials and best practices on that. And again, so much of that work was really around outputs being too slow, technology teams going too slow, all those sorts of things, right? Innovation being too slow. And now that constraint, in as much as organizations are able to adopt AI for accelerating outputs, I think that's exactly what happens is we need to look for constraints in delivering outcomes. And now delivering outcomes, I think the interesting thing about it is that this is it's a dynamic system and feedback loop, right? So you have to look at the entire loop. And so there's specific guidance on, for example, if you don't have a clear feedback mechanism between your customers, be that an internal or external customer. If it's an internal customer, it might be for platforms like how well are we providing self-service on this platform to our internal teams? If it's external, how quickly are people adopting these various features that we're providing them? So if you don't have that kind of telemetry and visibility, the feedback telemetry and visibility, well, that's a constraint in your outcome loop, right? Your outcome loop is not properly connected. If you don't have clear mapping between your strategy and budget into what you're delivering, that's another disconnect in the outcome loop. So there's basically, in the whole chapter on outcome loop optimization, a lot of it is around making sure the outcome's connected properly. So you can look at where you've actually got gaps in telemetry. And then, of course, to look at where you've got constraints, right? Because a common constraint is planning is too slow, right? Is that there's the feedback, the teams know the feedback, but it takes to get through quarterly planning around making significant business decisions. It takes, I don't know, 2, 4, I've seen 6 weeks to get through quarterly planning. And then you don't have the feedback to the teams quickly enough for them to build that next set of things. So actually planning is a very frequent constraint that it was surprising to me just how frequent it was in these organizations. And again, if you've got planning moving too slowly, you're not able to move at this kind of speed. So I think that's the key thing, is to look at the outcome loop, apply the theory of constraints to it, see if you've got any gaps first, and then look at what the constraint is. And of course, we all have some familiarity with planning being constrained from, back from that, very slow waterfall planning processes, but these things get amplified massively when the team's ability to deliver is no longer the constraint.
Thank you.
Great question. So our next question will come from James. Would you like to take yourself off mute, James, and ask a question, please?
Yeah, I think the previous person who asked the question, and Mik eloquently answered and kind of easily dovetails into what I was going to ask, which is, build velocity increasing and is going to increase further. While the consumption side, I don't think the reciprocation is there at the same velocity, thereby leading to that gap in that qualitative feedback. So you would end up with teams building, not receiving the feedback, and then disgruntled because they haven't seen the fruits of their labor. So how do you connect the two And will this somehow erode the outcomes that the AI promises? Thank you.
Yeah. So I think, again, that's that kind of gap in outcome metrics. That's the situation. Outcome metrics are these lagging metrics, and the teams might not be connected and just not have the feedback to the outcomes. And again, I think that is just a dysfunction. So I think if that's the case, the teams don't have ownership of outcomes, and there's something wrong with the structure. So in terms of moving at the speed that AI enables, every team needs to be able to have visibility into their outcomes, which can require changes from the way sales and marketing work, the way business operations work, and the rest. But if you want to move into this model, the teams need feedback. Because if you can have ownership of outcomes, and the teams, again, the mechanisms proposed here say the team has full autonomy over what outputs they produce. So no one above them in the leadership structure can say, you're going to produce this. Because if what's happening then is that you actually have the ownership of outputs higher up in the managerial structure, and again, that just doesn't scale properly. It disempowers the teams. It's a little bit, and of course, that the teams needs to actually be able to define how it wants the outcomes to evolve, right? So the outcome loop can leverage things for improving outcomes like OKRs and similar mechanisms, but who should decide what's valuable to that customer? And actually, Matt Rink here put that Mark Schwartz quote, the business value is what are business values, right? Which is, there's truth to it, which is why the outcome metrics are specific to your business, to the rest. But it's not, if those are disconnected from what a team does, if they're not properly decomposed into this team's goal is to make the best chat-enabled mobile experience for business X, and they have ownership of basically what they've taken as inputs, which is their budget, their token costs, and inference costs, and so on, and the outcomes they produce for the business. So they're actually, once you decompose this cascade of the outcome tree properly, it's actually the team that's responsible for defining business value for what it's delivering to its customer and how that's going to evolve over time. And that just needs to cascade up in a way that's aligned to the strategy. And so that's the bigger difference from this. Well, here are the financial metrics and our KPIs. How are we, how are you going to improve these? To actual this decomposition of ownership, where you've got end-to-end ownership of the inputs, the outputs of the outcome at the team level, and then that just cascades into higher and higher into the organization.
Okay. I'm going to jump in here with probably what will be our final question. We've only got a few minutes left, and we don't want to keep you too long here, Mik. But it's for Debbie. Debbie Bray, would you like to ask your question, please?
Hi, Mik. So I currently work for a government organization, and there's a lot of constraints that still exist there. Sometimes the funding and contracting and reporting structures just don't create those incentives like you were talking about in order to make sure that your ways of working align. Do you have any ways to measure those kind of delivery metrics, or any recommendations for how we can still make advances even though we have those constraints?
Yeah, and I think the outcome loop metrics are high level enough that I think they should be applied to that, right? If procurement, and again, we're looking at applying theory of constraints to delivering value through value streams and teams. And if, let's say, procurement is a main constraint at that point, or contractors are your main constraint, or onboarding, any of those sorts of things, that needs to show up within that telemetry. And so I think the challenge in a lot of these sorts of federal cases is exactly that, is that there's just further disconnect between where the work is being planned and where the work is being done, and then additional hands-off and all of that. And I think the first thing is just to make that more visible, so just actually understand how long the wait states there are. And then, before, let's say, throwing AI at the problem, right? Because again, the failure mode is you don't change any of that, let's say procurement structure, and you throw AI at the problem, either at the contractor side or your side, and you've got additional spend, but no additional value to show for it, because that was not the constraint. So I think just getting that visibility and then using some combination of just the recommendations the book makes around organizational design, applying AI to actually looking at those ways to resolve those constraints, when they're, again, the point being, they usually have to do with organizational structure and process, which is, I think, obviously more complex in a federal context, which is another reason why I think the models and output to outcome, as well as using AI to apply those models to understand how to change your organizational structure and processes, can actually help accelerate some of the things that have been harder to do in the past.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. We're officially at time. So Mik, I was going to see what you wanted to do. Would you be happy to take one more, or do we
Yeah,
need to
sure, we can
wrap?
do one more question.
One more? Okay. Well, there's a really good question about leadership here. Question number 9 from Andrew Mayer. Andrew, would you better quickly ask your question, and we'll see if we can work our way through it.
Yeah, this comes from an article I read last year, and it talked about this concept of organizational immune systems, and the argument was that, particularly in big legacy companies and regulated industries, that they have very strong immune systems which have grown up over decades, and AI and the way AI works is just incompatible with it, and it's a leadership challenge that you actually have to somehow reset your organizational immune system to allow the good parts of AI in, while still retaining the identity, the principles, and the foundations of AI, of what made your immune system work for your organization. So if you take, healthcare, finance, education, industries like that, this is a huge challenge. So I'm just wondering, how do you go about doing that reset, and have you actually seen any leaders do it well?
Yeah, so that's a big question. So I'll try to do it a little bit of justice. I guess the way I look at it, just to stick with a metaphor, and I think the organizational immune system metaphor is actually a good metaphor, right? Because in some cases it's killing bad things, and in some cases it's an allergic reaction to something that's not bad. And I think the challenge that a lot of us have seen is that there have been immune systems who've stalled product operating model or agile initiatives, or again, things have changed in one part of the organization, typically technology, but not changed sufficiently in the business. And I think we're right now at such a substantial event in changing, just the nature of knowledge work, that organizations are going to be forced to change. So it's just a question of how they will change. And I think there are aspects, of course, of those immune systems that are good, right? These organizations a lot of organizations function well, have good governance, have maintained great customer communities and happy customers over these years. So there's a lot to that these hierarchical organizational structures and portfolios that really works. And but there are things that don't. And I think fundamentally what output to outcome addresses is that a lot of what doesn't work is this layering, this constant layering of complexity that's been done through digital transformation, through agile transformation. Because now there's multiple sets of ceremonies, coordination, again, these disconnects between business operations, technology operations. And I think we need to, for these immune systems, we just need to change that whole thing. We need to keep, the organizational structures, those resilient structures built up over time, all of those make sense. But I think the only ones that will thrive are the ones where it becomes one structure. So I think AI changes these dynamics so completely that if you're trying to manage 3 or 4 different hierarchies and sets of ceremonies and QBRs and PI planning and Scrum and safe ceremonies, it just can't scale, and it's that way of operating is just too slow, and the costs are too high to move at the speed of AI. So I think it really is around going back to the structure of the organization, the skeletal structure of the organization, and looking at, okay, what is our primary structure? What is our what is our set of portfolios, how do team and agents support those portfolios, and create, and well, because you probably can't do it overnight, is move to this cleaner single structure with minimal matrixing, minimal dependencies, and a structure that really is based on outcome ownership, not output ownership.
Okay. Sounds like your question was answered. We're going to wrap there, folks. Thank you, Mik, for staying over time. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time. The lead up to a book launch is always a very busy period, and we're very excited for your book launch. There's lots of interest here. Mik, what's the best way to get a copy, would you say?
Just go to output-to-outcome.org or Google for output to outcome, and then probably the easiest is just Amazon, assuming that's there in your region. But of course, like Kindle and Porchlight, and there are other links there. But yeah, usually the quickest is just go on Amazon, and it'll ship on July 14th. So
I've already ordered mine, and I put a link in there so you can pre-order, folks, in the Zoom chat. I want to say big thanks to my co-host, Jen Ryan. Thank you very much for the support and everything you've done to make this event successful. And a huge thank you to the Sooner Safer Happier community. Great to see so many folks from all over the world join us today. So without further ado, a big thank you, and Mik, all the best for your book launch next week.
thanks, Marcus, and thanks everyone for the great questions.